folks, and welcome back to my writing space. I'm Emily Wright, and today I'm going to be discussing a few of my characters and doing a chapter reading of chapter 20 of my new novel, Trial of Strength. So, first off, I asked you guys to tell me who your favorite characters were, and a few of you responded. So we'll go ahead with Ms. Michelle Wolf says that she loves the main character, Elizabeth, for the compassion that she has for others. And I have to agree with that. Elizabeth, her character is very compassionate, and she wants to do the right thing, but she has a problem with trying to make everybody happy, trying to please everybody, worrying about what other people think. And I kind of feel like that's something that a lot of us can relate to. I know myself personally, I kind of struggle with that. So I've heard time and time again, every time a writer writes something, a part of them is going to be in there somewhere. So, and then Miss Becky Winters, such a lovely name. My favorite is Amos, she says. He is like a sweet grandpa. He is very wise and gives Elizabeth good advice. So Amos is sort of that wise old man archetype that you find in literature and movies and film. He's very much a father figure to Elizabeth and a grandfather figure to her, because she doesn't really have one with her parents' death, and Uncle John is one who he wants to do what's best for her. He tries to do everything in his power to do what's best for her, but the ways that he goes about it are not always the best. So Amos is really one. He is very wise. He does help to kind of mentor Elizabeth, and Ruby does that as well. Ruby is that no-nonsense grandmother figure in the story. So Elizabeth kind of needs that little bit extra push sometimes. So Ruby gives that to her. My personal favorite is Tom. And the reason that Tom is my favorite is because he's just one that's really fun to write things for. And I'll give you an example of that. In chapter 20, this piece was actually part of my senior thesis at Union University, which I forgot to mention in my last Facebook Live. Huge shout out to Union University English department faculty. You guys are awesome. And so yes, this one was part of my senior thesis. Part of it actually got published in the Copperfield Review a few years ago. So here is chapter 20, and this is why Tom is so much fun to write things for. Okay, here we go, chapter 20. Elizabeth couldn't sleep again. A candle burned on the windowsill, the flame providing little comfort. She despised herself. Never had she spoken her beliefs about slavery. She'd kept silent, never sang a word to anyone. Afraid of what might happen, what she might lose. Elizabeth shook her head, almost laughing at herself. What had she to lose in comparison to the slaves? Disapproval had scared her, knowing what Uncle John and Rosalie would think of her. Maybe there was something she could have done. Yet how could God allow these atrocities to happen? She clenched her hand into a fist when suddenly she heard a frantic voice coming from the guest bedroom, and Elizabeth sprang up and threw a robe over her nightgown. She took the candle before rushing into the room, bare feet padding across the cold floor. Tom was thrashing again, this time mumbling the word no over and over. Elizabeth quickly set the candle upon the table, going over to the edge of the bed. You have to wake up, she tried, seeing his eyelids tighten, then abruptly snap open. They shot him, he's dead. He's dead. It's all right, you're all right, Elizabeth said. It was another dream. Tom's breath was rapid, sweat glistening upon his neck. He lay his head back on the pillows, grasping hold of the quilt as if it were his only protection. Elizabeth went to the water pitcher, pouring a glass before handing it to Tom. "Drink this, it will help." Tom reached out to take it, hands trembling so badly that the water sloshed onto the bed. "I'm sorry," he said under a shaky breath. Elizabeth took the glass from him, placing her hand under Tom's head and gently pushing it forward to meet the edge of the glass. She placed the cup to his lips, tilting it back. When he downed the cool liquid, Elizabeth carefully lowered his head back down, hearing the deep breaths he took to calm himself. "More water?" she asked. "No, laudanum." "You're only to have it in an emergency." "I need it," he argued. "No, you don't. I can't give it to you." "You can't tell me I don't need it. You don't know the pain I'm in." Elizabeth closed her eyes. He was near to shouting now, yet she knew better. "It was a dream, Mr. Murphy, only a dream. I will sit with you." "No," Tom replied, his voice suddenly dejected. "It wasn't a dream. I wish it was." Elizabeth paused, remembering how he'd screamed that first day. "David, they shot him." "I'm so sorry," she tried, the words sounding so incompetent. She turned toward the door, stopped when she heard a small voice behind her. "Don't go." Elizabeth turned, seeing Tom staring at her, pleading. She sat down in the chair, pulling it to the very edge of the bed. Tom sighed, closing his eyes as he tried to relax. "It was our first battle, at Belmont, Missouri. My regiment had been held in reserve, waiting in a marsh. We could hear the cannons in the distance, louder than any thunder I'd ever heard. David was my tent mate. He'd worn round spectacles like Dr. Morris. Talked a lot. He'd been reading from his Bible while we waited." He sucked in a breath. "General Grant sent word to Colonel Logan requesting the 31st to the front. I thought I'd been ready. We all had, but we weren't. I couldn't bring myself to load my rifle. I just stared at them. Colonel Logan ran up to me, screamed at me to load and shoot. I did as I was told, just as I'd done countless times before. I started to pour the powder into the barrel and gunshots filled the air, some of our men dropping to the ground, some screaming, others staring up at the sky without uttering a sound. Men I'd seen in camp now had holes in their bodies." Elizabeth cringed. She'd seen casualty lists, yet had never known what horrors lay within those battlefields, what those men went through. She felt sick to her stomach, yet remained quiet, listening to him speak with eyes still closed. I aimed my rifle, pulled the trigger, my bullet missing its target. I repeated the process without thinking, just aiming, loading, firing as I forced myself to stand there. Southern men were falling just as rapidly as northern ones. I aimed and fired, striking one man in the chest, and I could only watch as the man twisted backwards and fell into the mud. I hated myself for what I was doing, wanted to run, and I thought, what if they aren't ready to die? Tom seemed to be forcing himself to choke out the words. Cannons were ripping our lines apart, and the colonel gave the order to fall back. I ran, grasping my rifle in my hands, praying for more speed. David was beside me, and we both ran as fast as we could to the trees when he stopped, uttering a small cry. David was shot in the back. He wasn't screaming, and I grabbed his arm, tried to pull him. He wasn't making any noise, and Tom let out another cry, body shaking violently as he wept uncontrollably, tears coursing down his face, dripping down his cheeks and nose and onto the quilt below. Elizabeth felt her heart break, and she reached out, taking his hand in her own. A knot lay in her throat, and she felt her eyes mist, allowed her tears to quietly flow. It was horror that Elizabeth knew she could never imagine. Tom had been right. She didn't know the pain he was in. She sat quietly, listening as his breathing became slower, sobs ceasing. "I'm sorry," he whispered in a shaky breath. "Please don't apologize," said Elizabeth quietly. She felt him give her hand a small squeeze, saw the anguish lying within his puffy red eyes. She imagined what it would be like if she were in his place, and the thought of it turned her stomach. He was only 17. We both were. Where was God when he was dying? Where is he on a battlefield? He removed his hand from hers, wiped his eyes. I wrote to his mother. She deserved to know that someone was there with her son. Elizabeth remembered the casualty list, cries of mothers as they read their sons' names written in black letters. One woman had gone mad, never leaving the house again until she died of a weak heart. Only 17. Where was God when he was dying? She didn't have an answer. Silence filled the room until she suddenly felt Tom's hand cover her own, sending chills through her, though not the kind which came from fear. Thank you for listening, he said, voice hoarse from crying. Of course, Mr. Murphy, she replied, wiping at her tears with her free hand. Call me Tom. Elizabeth nodded silently, though her heart had begun to hammer within her chest. Would you like more water, Tom? She noticed his ever so slight smile as he shook his head. No, thank you. His eyes began to close, and she watched as he stopped shaking, his hand still clasped over hers. Elizabeth kept vigil over him. Tom's breathing became more and more steady as she seemed to relax. The orange flicker of the candle cast a warm glow over Tom's face, illuminating his brown hair, curls falling over the white pillow. Dark lashes formed a line underneath his eyes, mouth curving above a stubbly chin. Elizabeth absently struck her thumb across his knuckles with her free hand, feeling the softness of his skin. She looked down, noticing how large and square his hand was in comparison with her own. Abruptly, she stopped, breath catching in her throat. Never had she dared such a thing before. She looked up at him again, feeling the deep pounding of her heart. Elizabeth slowly slid her hands away, watching to see if Tom would stir. When he didn't, she stood, taking the candle before she crossed over to the door. Good night, Elizabeth, he whispered from the bed, and she instantly felt warmth rise to her face. Good night, she stammered, leaving the door open as she went out. Her face was flushed, and she knew he'd felt the stroke of his hand. No, that's not right. Her face was flushed, and she knew he'd felt her stroke his hand. There we go. Elizabeth pressed her back against the wall where she stood in the hallway. It was very wrong. She couldn't continue with this. Knew she'd been overstepping her bounds. Common sense told her to stay her distance, to do exactly what Rosalie and Mr. Davis had said. There was one problem. She didn't want to. Elizabeth closed her eyes, bowing her head. God, what am I supposed to do? She couldn't abandon him, couldn't send him back to his regiment, especially not after what he just confided in her. And he'd called her Elizabeth. That is chapter 20. So that is a little sample of one of the things that Tom has gone through, which kind of helps to build his character and kind of establish the fact that he is he's very determined. He has a very do or die attitude. He'll do anything that he believes is right, and he will do that to the best of his ability. And that was his experience of his first battle that he relayed to Elizabeth. And he has a little bit of PTSD, if you haven't noticed. They didn't have a name for it back then. They didn't know anything about PTSD or anything like that. And so they just had to deal with it in their own way because, there was no therapy for that or anything. So Tom is struggling with a lot of things in his life. And if you haven't read it yet, I'll let you discover what Tom's big secret is, because he's carrying a big secret with him. So I leave you with that little tidbit. Thank you so much for joining me on Facebook Live on this Monday. And I ask that if you have read the book, if you would please leave a review on my Facebook page and or my Amazon the page on Amazon where you can buy the book. If you would please leave a review. That would be fantastic. I would appreciate that extremely much. But I'm running out of time here, so I hope you have a great day, great week. God bless. Stay safe. Goodbye.